Welcome to today's podcast, sponsored by Hauser's Dover Apothecary, hausershealthcare.com. With Christmas out of the way, it's the January show with Barb. How are you, Barb?
I'm awesome, Dave. How are you?
Good. I'm glad to see that you guys made it through the holidays all intact and everything's ready to roll for a new year.
It
Your article
is.
this month in the Hub, Reconnect Life and the Food Chain. And off air, we were talking about family, and it all connects. That's what that's what I like to talk about. But the biggest thing I took away from your article that we're going to start with today, and you got some explaining to do, young lady. Tell me about Barb the tomboy when she was a kid. I want to hear those stories.
Oh, I'm not sure that you do, Dave, but yeah, actually at Brian's and my wedding, uh part of my dad's speech was to warn Brian never to get into an arm wrestle with me because I would definitely win. He used to put money on me. I grew up in
Oh,
a neighborhood of 13 boys, and it was a while before my sisters came along, and there weren't any other girls in the neighborhood. So yeah, I was a full-out tomboy. It explains a lot of the concussions, right? I climbed a lot of trees, I played hard, but I loved it. So yeah, it was growing up in the country was such a gift. Hence, a lot of what I allude to in the article. But yep, definitely a tomboy and proud of it.
it's funny those things that you think about when you grew up in the country as a kid and what comes back. My first memory is the pigs out everywhere. They got out, right? And running
Hmm.
around. And it's just kind of what you laugh about it now, but you're like, at the time it was, my dad was on the lake fishing. So I remember my mother trying to gather up pigs, right? It's just,
Yep.
that's what life was back then.
Yep.
Pretty simple. And that's kind of where we're headed today, isn't it?
It is. It is definitely. Yep. It's that simplicity, that reconnection, I think is something that we take for granted if we grew up at all in sort of a rural type of setting, not necessarily on a farm, but maybe surrounded by farms. And that has become glaringly obvious, when we talk about, I think it was December, right, where everybody was up in arms about the label on butter that it may contain milk. And it's like, wow, we're here, are we? And it's really easy to poke a lot of fun at that and think it's absolutely ridiculous. But then you start to break it down. And, before the show came on and we were talking about your experience with the camp as well, is not everybody has any clue about farm life or country life. And we take for granted. I mean, there are people that live in the cities that don't own a car because they just have public transit and it works beautifully for them, but that's their life, these concrete jungles as opposed to these farms. So it's not necessarily that preposterous that people don't have an understanding of where their food comes from because they've never actually witnessed what a farm looks like.
Yeah, I found that, yeah, off air, we were talking a little bit about when we'd at our camps and we'd take kids to a farm every year. And I was amazed at how many kids, this was back in the early 2000s, how many kids had never been to a farm or understood what was going on at a farm. And it was I mean, the kids all had a great day.
Yeah.
And they learned so much, right? And that was part of it is like this, you're exposing them to what reality is, I guess, in that form of life. And it's important that they do that. And yeah, I agree. And even in town, like my grandfather had a wonderful garden. You know what I mean? And I think those things we got to get back to some of those basics. I think it's critical.
Yeah. Yeah, we really do. And I think we've become such a label society. We rely on those labels to instruct us on things that actually we should have more common sense and firsthand experience with. And, that whole connection to our food. I mean, we joined 15 years ago a local CSA program because, growing up, we always had a garden, but we're now on a town property surrounded by green space. But every imaginable rabbit and raccoon and squirrel and things like that were just wreaking havoc with the gardening that I was trying. So I'm like, well, we can't sustain ourselves in any way with what I'm getting out of what we're trying to do. Still love the experience. It's gotten better every year. But the CSA provides our family with nutrient dense, wholesome local food. And it supports local farmers. And, I know that what we're putting into our bodies is of value to our bodies. But there's just gotten to be such a big disconnect. I mean, we've got Uber Eats, we've got Skip the
Yeah.
Dishes, we've got all of these, where food shows up at your door. And I understand that it's an attempt for busy people to try to choose healthier. But to myself, there's so much satisfaction in the actual preparation and creation and truly honoring where the food comes from and the people that help provide it for us.
Yeah, and you also, I think when you prep a meal, you slow down mentally. I mean, you give
You do.
yourself the time, which I don't think many people
Mhm.
do anymore. And that's a great example. I just made a couple of big pots of veggie chili for over the holiday
Yeah.
for January and February, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. Getting back to that,
Mhm.
I enjoy cooking, but I mean, I think people need to actually understand that it's okay to take the time to do those things. Like,
Yes.
life's fast enough. That might be something that you enjoy. Take the time,
Mhm.
and you're looking at what you're eating again, right? You're looking at,
Yeah.
maybe I wanted organic crushed tomatoes in mine. You know what I mean? I just think the taste is better. But I mean, there's all those things that you sort of look at when you're cooking and prepping. And I think you're right. And on another note too, I remember my grandfather always had a big cherry tree, so he always made his own cherry wine, right? Which was incredible,
Great.
right? But I mean that's a little off topic, but I mean the whole point of it was he took the time and there was pride in it, and that recipe was handed down through the family. And
Yes.
I think that's kind of one
Yeah.
of those things that you need to commemorate and remember and then celebrate.
Mhm.
And what you're saying to the point is exactly it. And another one that crossed my mind when you were just bringing all this up was like, I remember, I think it's still going, is the John Ray's Community Garden,
Yeah.
right? And there's things like that are so critical for just feeding folks and helping folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially when people are more cash strapped perhaps than they have been in many years. You don't need a lot of land.
No,
You can have little pots in your kitchen, in your windowsill, and have at least fresh herbs through the winter season. You can grow a carrot from the carrot green and top by putting it in soil and so there's many things that we can be doing that it's actually economizing. Uh, One of my favorites for my clients, because I mean it's what, 5.99, 6.99 for a box of good quality vegetable broth. And
yeah,
it's like, okay, so you've got your celery ends, you've got your carrot peels, you've got your potato peels, and your onion skins and peels. And provided they've been washed and there's no mold or actual, nasty parts on it, put it in a pot with good clean water, throw some sea salt in it, and let it simmer. Afterwards, you strain off the liquid and you've got vegetable broth. And it's something that either was going into the waste or into the compost, but you've just made a vegetable broth and probably 3 or 4 boxes worth. So, that sort of economizing and the density of nutrients that comes from that is absolutely phenomenal. And here, we get it in our head that it's just waste material. So there are so many ways that people can be supporting themselves. And, then if you've got leftovers, maybe you've got some leftover chicken or beef if you're not vegetarian, you've got that broth and you add it in.
absolutely.
If you prep that veggie bin, for a few days or a week, then the choices are easy and you are skipping steps because you're preparing at not just for one meal. If you're preparing one meal at a time, yeah, that can be exhausting for busy families if they're running here and there for sports. But if you do it for 3 or 4 days or a week at a time, then you're economizing your time. Get the kids involved, get the hubby involved. If you want to put on some good tunes, maybe you want to have a glass of wine if that's your thing, but you can make that preparation a celebration and be honoring the density of the nutrients that are coming from that home prepared food. It's huge, and it's very satisfying.
You don't bring it up, but I want to ask you about this because this, when you just said there's another component there, when you're growing your own herbs in your house in January, February, March, it actually, I think it helps you mentally because there's the smells, there's the feel, right? There's all that that goes
Hmm.
into it that we didn't really talk about, which is kind of critical too, because that's another
Right.
aspect of your life that you want to keep improving. So it's kind of
Yes,
funny how those little things like that, right? Like you said, they don't need a lot of attention, but they
yeah.
provide more than you realize.
They do. It's not just the pleasure of seeing something grow and thrive, but many of our common herbs are just power packed with nutrients, phytonutrients, and these trace nutrients are good for their natural antivirals. The nutritional benefits to them go far beyond that aroma or that flavor that we are trying to add to a dish. So, your rosemary, your thyme, your oregano, your basil, all of these have incredible properties to them. And it's very, very easy, if you have a pot that for whatever reason of plants that isn't thriving well, snip them off, put them on a cookie sheet to flash freeze them, and then you can dice them up and put them in a container in the freezer. So you don't have to necessarily commit to the whole winter if you've got it put aside. A lot of people like to hang and dry their herbs in a good space. So there's lots of opportunity for us to not be investing huge amounts of money into, and how much you use in a year, right?
Yeah.
Like if you've got a jar of spices that you've bought that you look at the date and it's like, wow, that's been here since 2019. I wonder what the nutritional value or the flavor is left. So how much of something that you're using for your family. So that's the beauty of when you're growing and preserving things yourself. But it's just understanding that connection, understanding where things come from. I will never forget milking by hand my uncle's cattle. And, it's just that experience with your head up against, and the contented sound of the cattle and your head's against them and it's warm and the cats are around. Like it's just, and so many people don't have any of those valuable connections. They didn't climb trees, they didn't build tree forts, they didn't, fish from the irrigation pond with a piece of string and a safety pin.
Yeah.
Like there's just getting real, getting connected, and really appreciating that whole circle of life and the common sense that comes from these actual experiences as opposed to these ridiculous labels we're seeing nowadays. I mean, honestly, they're going to start to charge us more for insulation on things because they've wrapped the labels around so many times to give you all of these warnings and cautions. And really, we need a better education. We need a fresh start at children,
Yeah.
right? It's, one thing to be an adult and decide that, hey, I want to learn about that, but we really need to start that in the growing years when the brain is just so thirsty for information.
Do you think society, I think when we were talking earlier about people in a rush and just ordering takeout or doing whatever they have to do to get the meal together, I
Hmm.
feel backwards a little bit on this, that there's this feeling that they think it's new. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it's like when you buy a new car, ooh, look, it's good, it's shiny, it's new. And I think they've almost taken that to food rather than understand that they could make actually really good food, like healthy food. And there's
Hmm.
this perception that it's new, so it's just been done, right? And nothing
Yeah.
further from the truth sometimes. But I think that's kind of the mindset sometimes, that we don't actually see that, or we become addicted to certain tastes. So we just accept
Yeah.
that as what we want all the time. rather than trying
Mhm.
to diversify a little bit backwards to what probably is more obviously would be more healthier and more realistic to what our body needs. Is that this is my last
Mhm.
question because I know you got to get going, but I want to know, is that the biggest thing you see in your business? Is people just eating wrong? It's like, is that one of the major concerns that you first step into with them?
It is. It's definitely the causative factor in my experience and my studies that lack of nutrition through inferior food quality and that disconnect is the types of foods that are processed and ultra processed. Uh, they've been stripped of so many nutrients, and then synthetic vitamins and minerals are added back into them. So the actual nutrition that gets to the body is less than half of what's being put into it because the body has to take that synthetic nutrition and convert it into something that the cells of the body understand. But you're right, we have confused affluence and the ability to purchase these things made by factories and outside sources, that but that's where all our chronic disease is thriving from. That affluence and that lack of connection to food from where it starts is actually what's feeding into so many of these chronic diseases, the type 2 diabetes, any sort of itis, okay, so any sort of inflammation in the body. And it's the additive ingredients. Okay, so MSG, for instance, monosodium glutamate, it excites the brainstem and it actually increases the desire to eat more. Well, no wonder they're adding it to food
Yeah,
because if we can get people to consume more,
they spend
and
more.
and so
Yeah.
you know where I'm going with that.
Mm.
But, the type of salt that you're using, just table salt is reduced to sodium chloride, and I invite people to do the flavor test to get some Celtic salt or some Himalayan
Very interesting.
salt and just put a little on your finger, stick it on your tongue, taste what that tastes like, and then try that with the table salt. And I have yet to have a client that has ever gone back to table salt
Yeah.
after they taste what real salt with all 82 or 83 trace minerals actually tastes like. And it's mind blowing. But if you don't know, I mean, none of us know what we don't know
Right,
until we
exactly.
know it.
Yeah.
But once we're informed, it's a powerful growing experience, and we're never, ever, ever too old to learn. We're never too old to start to introduce even small positive changes, and that's what I try really, really hard with for my clients is just looking for better than steps,
Yeah.
because not everybody can tackle everything at once, and it's not achievable for a lot of people. So we just work on the little areas. It's like, okay, where's the most glaring problem? What's the most quick thing that we can do to make that easier, to make that a change? And that's so yeah, the food, absolutely. It's got to be the focus because it's what fuels our bodies.
It's we're gonna have another great year of podcasts. I can see that coming. Reconnect, life in the food chain. It's in the January hub. Barb, thanks for doing this. Quickly, how do people get a hold of you?
So 519-410-3544. You can text or call. And the email is barb@healthywellandwise.ca. So looking forward to hearing from you and Happy New Year, everybody.
Take care, Barb.
You too, Dave.
Thank you for watching today. Our podcast was brought to you by Hauser's Dover Apothecary, hauserhealthcare.com.